Welcome to Stories of the Wanderer, a calming sleep story series created to help you unwind and gently drift into rest. Tonight we enter the first chapter of Where the Sky Rests, Reflected Stars. In this chapter, the Wanderer explores a quiet observatory on the rim of a sleeping crater, where reflected starlight, warm copper, and the hush of the mountain reveal a gentle way of noticing the world. The night had already settled against the glass when the wanderer rested his hand on the inner rail of the observatory. The rail was made of copper, darkened by weather and time, and it held a warmth that seemed too gentle to belong entirely to metal. It wasn't the sharp warmth of a fire, nor the brief warmth of a hand just withdrawn, but something deeper and slower, drawn from the stone below, from the day that had passed across the crater, from the mountain itself, which kept its heat in silence and released it without haste. Around him, the observatory stood in a hush of curved panes and patient beams. Its glass walls leaned toward the sky, each panel fitted carefully into ribs of copper that had turned green in places where mist and ash touched them year after year. The seams were smoothed by wind, and the bolts were dulled by the cold, and the whole structure gave the impression of something built not to resist the mountain, but to live beside it with practiced respect. Outside, the volcanic rim fell away into darkness. There was no blaze, no restless glow, no spectacle calling attention to itself. The crater was present in a quieter way. It breathed with warmth rising from unseen places and softened the air just above the stone. It gave the night a low, grounded feeling, as if beneath all the stars and all the glass and all the open distance, the earth was remembering itself. The wanderer stood still for a long while, because stillness felt like the proper beginning here. He didn't look for a chair. He didn't look for a task. Instead, he simply let his eyes travel slowly around the observatory, from the heavy stone floor to the copper struts, from the struts to the glass, and finally from the glass to the immense dark ceiling of the world beyond. The sky was clear. It opened above the crater in a deep, soft black. It was not empty, but full of quiet pinpoints of light. The stars didn't glitter sharply. They seemed to breathe in place, steady and far, scattered across the darkness like small seeds of silver strewn upon a field too broad for any hand to gather. Some shone with a blue-white calm, and some were so faint that they appeared only when the wanderer stopped trying to notice them. Where the panes curved overhead, the stars appeared again in reflection, dimmer, closer, held for a moment in the glass before returning to the sky. The observatory smelled faintly of cooled metal, dry stone, and the mineral trace of ash. There was also a clean coldness, high and thin, like air that had passed over distant snow, though no snow lay inside the building. Near the lower edges of the glass, mist had collected in narrow veils. It blurred the outside stones into soft shapes, then thinned as warmth moved through the room, only to gather again along another seam, as slow as a drawn breath. The wanderer listened. There were sounds, but they were small and spacious. Wind slid around the outer shell in long, even strokes. Somewhere far below the rim, warmth moved through the stone with a murmur too deep to be called sound. A loose grain of ash rolled down a pane and came to rest against its frame. From beyond the observatory, on the wide, dark slope, there came the faint rustling of hardy grasses bending and rising in the thin night air. He felt no need to name everything. He had learned in other places and along other paths that naming could sometimes make the world smaller than it wished to be. Here, on the rim of the crater, he let the observatory remain more than a building and less than a mystery. He let the mountain remain warm and steady beneath him, and the sky remain high and open above him. He stood between them, held in the calm meeting of earth and starlight. After a time, he began to walk. His steps were soft on the stone floor. The floor had been laid in broad, dark slabs, each fitted close to its neighbor, the surfaces worn smooth near the center of the room and rougher near the walls. In some places, pale mineral lines ran through the stone like quiet rivers caught inside rock. In others, small grains of ash had settled into the seams, forming grey threads that traced the shape of the floor. The observatory was circular, but not perfectly so. Its shape followed the rim on which it stood, making slight allowances for the ground, the wind, and the angle of the crater wall. The wanderer liked this about it. There was a kindness in a structure that didn't insist on being exact, but instead learned the contour of its place. The wanderer moved toward the glass. Beyond it, the crater's rim curved away into darkness, its edge defined not by light, but by an absence of it, a gentle line where solid earth gave way to open depth. The stone outside was black, brown, and rust-red in the faint starlight, with patches of pale lichen clinging to sheltered surfaces. Low moss grew in small cushions where the mist settled, and in the shallow hollows between rocks, hardy grasses leaned together as though sharing warmth. A few silvery shrubs sprawled close to the ground, their thick leaves turned inward, storing whatever heat they could draw from the living earth below. Life here didn't spread abundantly. It kept close. It used little. It waited well. The wanderer regarded those small plants for a long time. He thought of how often strength was mistaken for reaching upward, for spreading out, for taking more space beneath the sun. Yet here, strength took another shape. It was low and rooted. It accepted ash. It accepted wind. It accepted cold. It didn't complain of the mountain, because to these plants the mountain wasn't an interruption. It was simply the condition of being here. He breathed in slowly. The air near the glass was cold enough to prickle the inside of his nose and throat. But beneath that cold, carried faintly through the floor, was the rounded warmth of the crater. Warmth below, cold above. Stone below, sky above. The place was made of contrasts that didn't quarrel. They simply rested together. As he walked along the inner curve of the wall, his reflection moved beside him, faint and dark, joined by reflections of stars that didn't belong to the room, and yet seemed, for a moment, to have entered it. The glass wasn't entirely clear. Age had given it subtle waves and tiny imperfections, so that the sky bent gently where it passed through. Stars stretched into soft threads near the edges of the panes, then returned to points at the center. The copper ribs divided the view into tall segments, each holding a different portion of night. The wanderer paused where several panes met above a narrow seam. There, in the glass, a star appeared twice. He looked up, then out, then back at the pane. A star high in the sky, pale and steady, seemed to hover lower in the glass, caught near the curve of its copper frame. A second reflection, fainter still, rested in the next pane, slightly displaced, as if the same light had taken a quieter route through the room. The wanderer smiled softly, not in surprise, but with the simple pleasure of noticing. He stepped aside just a little, and the reflected star shifted away. When he stepped back, the star returned to view. It was ordinary enough, he thought. That glass would reflect and a curved surface would change the path of light. A room built beneath the stars would naturally gather echoes of them. Yet there was something tender in the way these reflections waited for just the right place to be seen, as if the observatory had folded the sky into itself and was offering it back in gentle fragments. He continued along the wall. Another pane held another reflected point, then another. At first, they were faint and easy to lose if he looked directly at them. But when he softened his gaze, when he let the reflections and the true stars beyond mingle without forcing them apart, he began to notice a loose curve of light passing from one pane to the next. It wasn't bright. It wasn't a sign that announced itself. It was simply there, a quiet arc made from borrowed stars, each reflection resting in a different piece of glass. The wanderer didn't hurry after it. He allowed his steps to remain slow. The arc seemed to disappear when he approached too quickly, and to return when he stood still. He walked, paused, breathed, and looked, again and again. The unhurried rhythm suited the room, suited the mountain, suited the night, which had no reason to rush its turning. At the next pane, the mist had gathered more thickly, clouding the lower glass. A reflected star above that veil of white looked as though it floated over a pale shore. A narrow bead of water now slid down the pane, leaving a clear line behind it, and for that brief moment the reflection sharpened before softening again. The wanderer watched the bead descend, slow and silent, until it reached the copper lip at the bottom and vanished into the shadow below. He thought of all the small movements that filled a place even when it seemed still, moisture gathering, metal cooling, stone holding warmth, grasses bowing, stars shifting over spans too vast to feel, yet appearing to drift with perfect gentleness across the human eye. The world was never truly motionless. It only knew how to move without disturbance. A soft current of warmer air touched his hand. It rose from a narrow vent set into the stone near the wall, covered by a simple copper grate. The grate was warm, not hot, and its pattern was shaped like overlapping leaves. The wanderer crouched beside it and held his palm above the rising air. The breath of heat smelled faintly of minerals, dry and earthen, with a hint of something like rain on warm rock. The heat was steady, modest and kind. The observatory, he understood, didn't shut the mountain out. It allowed a little of the mountain in. Not too much, not wildly, not without care, but just enough that those who kept watch here would remember where they stood. Enough that the cold night did not become harsh. Enough that a body, small beneath all that sky, could feel supported by the ground below. He rose again and followed the reflected arc. It drew him toward the far side of the observatory, where the glass arched at a slightly different angle and the copper ribs stood a bit closer together. Outside, the crater's rim was lower on this side, revealing a wider reach of the sky. The dark slope beyond showed faint traces of ash, pale where starlight touched it. And near the base of the wall, he could see clumps of moss nestled in the shelter of stones. Those patches of moss looked almost silver in the night, soft and still, as if the earth had exhaled and left small breaths behind. The arc of reflections became clearer. One point, then another, then a third. Each appeared in separate panes, each aligned not out in the sky itself, but within the observatory's curving glass. The wanderer stood at the room's center and slowly turned in place. From that vantage, the arc was broken, scattered. When he stepped closer to the wall, it lengthened. When he moved toward the stone bench at the side of the room, it vanished. And when he returned to the copper rail near the entrance, 2 lights appeared again. There was patience in this, some quiet teaching. Certain things could be seen only from certain positions. Some meanings didn't disappear when no one was looking. They simply waited for someone to stand in the place where seeing them became possible. The wanderer rested his hand on the copper rail once more. Its warmth had faded only slightly. Beneath his fingers, the surface felt subtly uneven, not damaged, but shaped by long use. He imagined other hands resting here on other nights, hands roughened by cold, hands made fragrant by metal and wool, hands belonging to those who had watched the sky, brushed ash from the glass, opened and closed the shutters, followed reflections as he did, and learned the many moods of wind and warmth. He didn't need to know their names to feel their presence. The observatory remembered them, holding their memory in the gentle wear of the rail. A faint sound came from outside, high and brief. Perhaps it was a bird somewhere beyond the rim of the crater. The call was so soft it seemed almost part of the air, a single note released and then absorbed by distance. The wanderer turned his head toward it, and then the quiet returned, even deeper than before. He went to the door. It was made of thick wood banded with copper, set deep into the stone wall where the observatory opened onto a small outer landing. When he lifted the latch, it moved smoothly despite its age, and the door swung inward with a sigh of cool air. Outside, the night's chill touched his face at once. He stepped onto the landing. The ground beyond the observatory was uneven, but calm beneath his feet. Dark stones held warmth at their cores, while their surfaces had cooled under the stars. The crater's rim curved to his left, broad and shadowed. To his right, the outer slope fell away into a landscape of volcanic rock, sparse grasses, and low plants pressed close to the earth. Behind him, the observatory glowed faintly, not with lamps, but with gathered starlight and the dim burnish of its copper shell. From outside, the structure looked much smaller than it had from within. Inside, beneath the dome ceiling, the room had seemed large enough to hold the sky. Outside, under the true sky, it was once again a human thing, sturdy, careful, weathered, brave in a quiet way. Its glass panels caught the stars in broken fragments, and its copper ribs curved upward like the bones of some gentle instrument. Around its base, ash had collected in shallow drifts, smooth as sifted flour, interrupted only by the delicate tracks of wind and the rooted patience of moss. The wanderer walked only a little way along the rim. He didn't go near the edge. There was no need. The boundary was clear, not severe, and the path had been worn by those who knew how to move here. Small stones lined parts of it, half buried in ash, and between them grew grasses with narrow leaves that whispered whenever the wind passed. The crater below remained mostly unseen in darkness, but its presence was clear in the warmth rising from below, and the faint reddish glow that sometimes touched the underside of the mist. The mountain made no spectacle of itself. It simply existed, and that was enough. The wanderer stood with his cloak drawn around him and gazed back at the observatory. From this angle, several panes of glass were visible at once. The reflected arc he had followed indoors didn't show itself in quite the same way out here. Instead, the glass gathered the sky into scattered pieces, each pane holding its own small portion. Yet as he shifted his weight and looked along the curving wall, he noticed that even these scattered reflections belonged to a larger arrangement, one that couldn't be understood from a single viewpoint. He felt the beginning of curiosity deepen in him, gently, not urgency, not a need to find an answer, something quieter than that, a willingness to return, to look again, to let the place unfold its secrets in its own time. He straightened slowly. The wind moved around him with a soft, steady pressure, carrying a faint mineral scent from the crater. It was colder out here, but not unkind. The warmth from the ground rose through the soles of his boots, even as the air above cooled his cheeks. He stood between the two, as he had inside, held by opposites that belonged together. After a while, he returned to the door. The observatory welcomed him back with its stored quiet. The air inside felt warmer now, not because it had changed very much, but because he had just been in the open cold outside. He closed the door gently, and the latch settled with a soft click that didn't disturb the hush. The reflected arc was still there waiting where he'd left it, though it had shifted slightly with the turning of the sky. The wanderer crossed the floor, passing a stone bench, some folded blankets, a line of copper hooks, the warm grate, and the wide panes of glass. He made his way to the spot where the reflections had seemed most complete before. There he stilled himself and let his breathing slow until it matched the deep quiet of the room. Now the arc stretched from a high pane near the dome down to a lower pane by the far wall. It curved downward, though no such curve existed in the stars themselves outside. It was a shape made by glass, by angle, by position. A shape created by the meeting of patient design and patient looking. He followed that arc with his eyes. At the lower end of the arc, one reflected star rested near a vertical seam between two panes of glass. The seam was darker than the others, burnished where many hands had touched it at roughly the height of his own, and it was almost lost in shadow. The wanderer approached slowly. As he neared the wall, the reflection wavered and disappeared, not because the star itself had moved, but simply due to the changing angle as he came too close. He stopped and stepped back again. The reflection returned, settling near the seam like a small star trapped in the copper. He waited. The mist on that portion of the glass thinned. The faint star point in the pane brightened. Now he noticed a pair of faint lines in the copper seam, too regular to be a scratch, too softened by age to be new. The wanderer leaned in closer. There, etched into the copper at the seam, was a small symbol. It was simple, almost humble. A shallow curve beneath a single point of light, like a low horizon cradling a lone star, or a bowl catching a falling drop. Its edges were worn smooth, as though many fingers had touched it over years, perhaps in greeting, perhaps in gratitude, or perhaps just because hands are drawn to where other hands have been. The wanderer didn't touch the mark right away. He only looked. The symbol rested exactly where the reflected arc appeared to end. Without the reflection, it might have seemed just a bit of decoration or a maker's mark. With the reflection, it felt less like ornament and more like a meeting place. Light from the sky, shaped by glass, had come to rest upon copper warmed by the earth. Above and below, far and near, cool and warm, ancient and human, the observatory had quietly brought them all together. At last, the wanderer lifted his hand and pressed 2 fingertips to the tiny engraving. The copper was warm, not by much, but just enough. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could feel the room around him more clearly than he could see it. The stone under his feet was holding steady. The glass around him cooled and cleared. The copper beneath his fingers carried a mild, living heat. Outside, the grasses bowed in the wind. The mosses clung quietly to the rocks, and the crater breathed without effort. The stars remained far beyond reach, yet they were present in every reflective surface the observatory offered them. He thought about how many places in the world urge people to move quickly, to decide, to measure, to seek answers before questions have fully opened. This place asked something else entirely. It asked for attention without strain. It asked for patience without emptiness. It asked the body to stand with such stillness and patience that the hidden arrangements of things could at last become visible. The wanderer opened his eyes. The reflected arc had shifted again. Its lowest point had already drifted just beyond the little symbol, and the shape was loosening, returning to scattered stars. Soon, that delicate arc would vanish from this exact alignment, but nothing had truly been lost. The sky would continue. The glass would find other angles. The copper would remain warm along its seam, and perhaps on another night, from another careful position, the arc would gather itself together once more. He stepped back and let his hand fall to his side, then moved to the stone bench and sat down. The blanket there felt coarse and soft at the same time, woven from wool that carried a faint scent of cedar and cold air. He draped it over his lap, not because he was very cold, but because the gesture belonged to the night. Then he leaned back against the stone wall, cool against his shoulders and steady behind him in a way that quieted his body. From where he sat, he could only see the part of the symbol. It appeared and disappeared as fresh mist gathered on the glass. The arc of reflections had broken apart, but a few stray points of light still trembled in the panes, each holding its place for a breath before quietly shifting. The room now returned to its first simplicity, a sheltered circle on a volcanic rim, a copper frame beneath a vast sky, a human warmth within an immense landscape. The wanderer let his thoughts loosen. He thought of the lichen outside, receiving ash and moisture without complaint. He thought of the grasses bending with the wind, not yielding in defeat, but moving in the only way that allowed them to remain. He thought of the crater, active and stable, powerful and calm, giving warmth without asking to be understood. He thought of the stars, whose distance made human worries feel lighter, not because those concerns didn't matter, but because they didn't need to fill the entire sky. A softness entered him then. It began in his shoulders, which lowered without any conscious decision. It moved into his hands, which opened where they rested upon the blanket. It settled behind his eyes, where the effort of looking gave way to the ease of simply being. He listened to the wind brushing over the glass, to the faint settling of metal as the copper cooled, and to the almost silent breath of warmth rising through the floor. The observatory never promised that everything would be known. It offered something gentler. It promised that attention could be enough for one night, that mystery could remain kind, that warmth could rise from deep places without becoming unrest. It promised that a small mark worn smooth by unknown hands could offer wordless companionship. And it promised that the sky, far above all else, could still find its way into a room through glass, through water, through a patient eye. The wanderer's gaze drifted upward. The dome held the night in fragments. Between the copper ribs, stars rested in dark panes, then slipped into reflection and returned to the distance beyond. The mist thinned and then formed again, while the wind passed and passed again. Outside, the crater's rim lay in shadow, and beyond it, the open world seemed to breathe with the same calm rhythm as the room. He wondered softly whether the symbol marked only the end of the reflected arc, or if it might be part of a larger pattern extending beyond the observatory's walls. Perhaps there were other marks, other quiet alignments, other places where light and earth had been invited to meet. Perhaps the observatory wasn't revealing a hidden secret as much as teaching him a way of noticing the world, one small sign at a time. That thought didn't pull him from his rest. It nestled beside him like another blanket. He didn't need to rise again, not yet. The night was still deep, the room was warm enough, and the mountain beneath him remained steady in its long, slow breathing. He let the question stay where it was, shining faintly in his mind like a reflected star on copper. After a while, his eyes drifted once more to that narrow seam in the glass. The little symbol was barely visible now. Mist had softened the pain around it, and the reflected stars had wandered away from their arc. Yet the mark remained, hidden but present, worn by touch, warmed by the earth, patiently waiting for the next gentle gaze. The wanderer rested his head against the stone. In the shelter of copper and glass, with the crater below and the sky above, he let the quiet expand around him. The wind moved softly. The floor held steady. The mountain gave up its warmth without hurry. And somewhere within the observatory, almost beyond sight, the small curve beneath a single point kept its place in the darkness, as if holding open the possibility of another gentle discovery whenever the night was ready to reveal it.